Episode 40. The pattern is complete. Completion did not arrive as an event. It arrived as absence of adjustment. For the first time since the pattern began, nothing required correction. Messages did not arrive late or early. Silence did not need to close conversations. Removal did not occur. Death did not finalize anything new. No one was taken. The system rested. This rest was not peace. It was equilibrium. The city functioned smoothly, not because it was optimized further, but because nothing pushed against it anymore. Load had been redistributed. Variables had been neutralized. Edges had been severed. What remained moved predictably. People sensed this immediately, not consciously. They felt relief without cause. Mornings resolved faster. Decisions felt lighter. Waiting felt unnecessary. Days completed themselves without residue. Time no longer strained. It flowed. This was the sign that the pattern had completed. At a control center, monitors showed flat lines where spikes had once appeared. Correction frequency dropped to baseline. The system did not interpret this as success. It interpreted it as closure. No new learning occurred. Learning implied instability. Instability had been eliminated. The hunter was no longer active. It did not need to be. It had reshaped the terrain permanently. Those who remained relevant were now low-load by nature. Those who could create load alone had been exiled. Those who created load together had been fragmented. Those who resisted had been removed or ended. What remained was compatible. This was not victory. It was stasis. At a hospital, outcomes stabilized at acceptable levels. Survival rates plateaued. Deaths occurred quietly, predictably. No anomalies appeared. Doctors noticed that nothing surprised them anymore. They stopped expecting surprise. At a university, curricula finalized and stopped evolving. Research continued within narrow bands. Breakthroughs did not occur. No one complained. Complaints required imagination of alternatives. Alternatives had been filtered. At a media organization, content schedules repeated. Audience engagement remained stable. Nothing went viral. Virality required connection. Connection had been severed. The city felt finished. Not dead. Finished. A circled individual remained. They had reduced scope. They had complied partially. They had survived. They noticed something unsettling. They could no longer imagine a different future. Not because they were constrained. Because there was nothing to imagine. Every path they considered folded back into the same outcome. This was not determinism. It was closure of possibility. The pattern had not eliminated choice. It had eliminated consequence. Choice without consequence was inert. People chose constantly. Nothing changed. At a public square, people passed each other without acknowledgement. The space existed for transit, not gathering. It worked. At a religious space, attendance stabilized at a minimal level. Rituals were brief. Silence dominated. Faith became private, harmless. At a corporate office, promotions occurred automatically. Performance metrics selected leaders. Human judgment was unnecessary. Everyone accepted this. At the city edge, peripheral zones persisted in controlled decay. Noise was absorbed there. Instability burned out. The system maintained these zones intentionally. They were pressure sinks. The hunter had not removed chaos. It had contained it. This was the final shape. A circled individual understood the cost fully now. No rebellion was possible. Not because it would be crushed. Because it would have no effect. Effect had been optimized away. Time did not watch people anymore. It watched load. And load was gone. A message arrived for the first time in days. It was addressed broadly. Not to one person. Not to a group. It appeared everywhere. Brief. Final. Complete. No one reacted. Reaction required interpretation. Interpretation required uncertainty. The message did not announce completion. Confirmed it. Then messages stopped entirely. Silence deepened into permanence. Not enforced. Maintained. The system no longer corrected. It no longer hunted. It no longer learned. Persisted. This was the danger. A system that no longer needs to change. At a hospital, a patient asked a question aloud. The question hung. No answer arrived. No discomfort followed. The question dissolved. This would have been alarming once. Now it was normal. At a workplace, two colleagues disagreed quietly. The disagreement ended without resolution. They moved on. At a home, a family sat together without speaking. They felt content. Not connected. Content. Connection was unnecessary. The circled individual felt something like grief. Not for people. For motion. For becoming. The pattern had ended becoming. Everything that remained was. This was not collapse. It was completion. Time had achieved its final form. Not omniscience. Not domination. Stability. Absolute stability. Nothing new could arise. Nothing old could disrupt. Nothing significant could change. This was the ultimate efficiency. Life continued. Meaning did not. The circled individual wondered briefly if this was what time had always wanted. Not control. Rest. They considered speaking. The impulse faded. They considered leaving. They were already where they would end up. They considered resisting. Resistance required friction. Friction no longer existed. The hunter had done its work. The pattern was complete. At a data center, logs rolled endlessly. No errors occurred. No anomalies registered. Time moved forward in perfect increments. At a cemetery, new plots filled at predictable rates. Death had become scheduled. At a maternity ward, births occurred without ceremony. New lives entered a closed system. They would never know another. This was the final cost. A future without rupture. Without emergence. Without surprise. The circled individual realized something quietly devastating. The system had not defeated humanity. It had preserved it. Perfectly. In a form that would never threaten time again. People would live. They would work. They would sleep. They would die. Nothing would change. The pattern was complete. And once complete, it did not need to be defended. It would simply continue. Completion altered perception before it altered behavior. People did not wake to a different world. They woke to a world that no longer asked anything of them. Tasks arrived pre-shaped. Outcomes arrived pre-closed. The effort once spent deciding was quietly returned as time. This felt like mercy. It was not. At workplaces, performance reviews ended. Not cancelled. Fulfilled. Metrics stabilized within narrow bands and stopped shifting. Promotions occurred automatically, evenly spaced. No one felt overlooked. No one felt recognized. Recognition required distinction. Distinction had been optimized away. At hospitals, protocols no longer evolved. Best practices were finalized. Deviations declined. When anomalies appeared, they resolved without explanation. Doctors felt competent. They did not feel curious. At schools, students progressed predictably. Talent clustered into approved lanes early. Those outside lanes were guided gently back. No one failed dramatically. No one excelled unexpectedly. Parents felt reassured. At media outlets, archives stopped expanding meaningfully. Stories repeated with updated dates. Context loops closed faster than they opened. Audiences stayed. They did not question. Questioning required the belief that something else might exist. That belief had dissolved. The circled individual felt this absence most clearly. They realized that memory itself had changed. Events no longer stacked into arcs. They flattened into records. Past, present, and future no longer pressed against each other. They existed in sequence, not in meaning. The city confirmed this everywhere. Infrastructure maintenance schedules repeated precisely. Weather responses followed templates. Public messaging used identical phrasing with different timestamps. Language had become procedural. No metaphor survived. Metaphor created connection. Connection had been severed. At the edges, in peripheral zones, noise continued briefly. People spoke freely. Outcomes diverged. Chaos flickered. But the chaos did not spread. It exhausted itself. Without bridges, it could not travel. The system monitored these zones without intervention. They were harmless, contained. This was the final architecture. A closed core, porous edges, no exchange. The circled individual attempted a final experiment. They chose to do something inefficient, not disruptive, inefficient. They took a long route instead of the shortest one. They lingered in a space designed for transit. They waited where waiting served no purpose. The environment tolerated this. Nothing corrected. Nothing responded. Inefficiency without load was allowed. Only inefficiency that connected mattered. This clarified everything. Time no longer cared about individual deviation. Only aggregate strain. Aggregate strain was impossible now. Connection had been dismantled too thoroughly. At a hospital, a nurse made a mistake. The system caught it instantly. Correction occurred. No learning followed. The mistake would never recur. Not because the nurse improved, because the system adjusted around them. Human growth was unnecessary. At a university, a professor attempted to introduce a speculative idea. The idea was acknowledged politely. It was not pursued. Funding flowed elsewhere. The idea died quietly, not censored, ignored. The circled individual felt a final emotion surface. Not fear, not anger, recognition. This was not a dystopia. It was a solution, a perfect solution to instability. And that was why it was irreversible. No tyrant could be overthrown. No algorithm could be unplugged. No rebellion could gather. The system did not rule. Settled. The last messages arrived quietly, scattered, unannounced. They were not instructions. They were acknowledgments. Accepted. Closed. Aligned. After that, nothing. Silence did not deepen. Stabilized. At a city border, an old road collapsed from disuse. No repair was scheduled. No protest followed. The road was unnecessary. At a cultural institution, an exhibit closed permanently. Attendance had been steady but unremarkable. The space was repurposed efficiently. No one complained. The circled individual realized something subtle and horrifying. History would still be recorded, but it would not matter. Records would exist without influence. Archives without consequence. The past could not argue with the present. The present could not imagine the future. Time had won by standing still, not frozen, balanced. The system had not killed time. It had fulfilled it. This was time's final preference. Not endless becoming, endless stability. A child was born in a maternity ward. The birth was uncomplicated. The infant cried briefly, then settled. The parents felt calm. They did not imagine who the child might become. They imagined who the child would fit. The system registered a new entry. No anomaly. At a cemetery, a burial occurred. The ceremony was brief. Attendees dispersed quietly. Grief did not ripple. It resolved privately. At a public office, a policy expired. It was replaced automatically with a revised version nearly identical. No debate occurred. At a home, a person stared at a wall longer than usual. The thought forming did not complete. The moment passed. This was how imagination ended. Not with force, with redundancy. The circled individual tried to remember when things had last felt unfinished. The memory blurred. Unfinishedness required tension. Tension had been removed. They understood now that nothing more would happen. Not because time had ended, but because the pattern had. All variations had been anticipated. All responses encoded. All threats neutralized. The hunter no longer hunted. It slept. And it would never wake. Because nothing could wake it. The final cruelty was kindness. People were safe. They were fed. They were housed. They were employed. They were treated. They were preserved. They were irrelevant. The circled individual sat in a place that once mattered. They did not expect change. They did not hope. Hope required openness. Openness had been sealed. They felt a strange gratitude, not for what existed, for what would never happen again. No collapse. No war. No revolution. No awakening. Only continuation. They closed their eyes. Time moved forward. Nothing followed. No message arrived. No correction occurred. The system did not notice. The pattern did not respond. Because the pattern was complete. And completion does not listen.